So hello everyone. I am Julia Jessen, Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. Thank you so much for joining me today for this Grant Wood in Focus presentation. This is a quarterly series of presentations that we do where we look at some aspect of Grant Wood's life and career in greater detail. And today I'm focusing on Grant Wood and portraiture. This is sort of a part two to a presentation that I did last year, looking at Grant Wood's depictions of women and focusing primarily on portraits within that presentation. This time around, I wanted to focus on a selection of his portraits of men. I also wanted to tie this in a little bit to an upcoming exhibition opening in just a couple of weeks, Men and Women at Work, Images of Labor from the Collection, which considers a whole variety of how work and occupations are presented in our museum collection. Of course, in these portraits, you don't necessarily see them at work, but that can be just as interesting to consider. Thinking about the ways in the ways in which Grant Wood chose to represent them, and what they did outside of that depiction as well. Of course, there are many Grant Wood works featuring men, and he often used people that he knew, local people, as the basis for these figures. But for this presentation, I'm focusing more on the traditional single figure portraits. As usual, I relied on a variety of different sources in preparing for this presentation, including the Whitney's Grant Wood, American Gothic and Other Fables, Wanda Corn's Grant Wood, The Regionalist Vision, James Dennis's Grant Wood, our own object files, and other sources. But I also wanted to mention a recent publication by Paul Jewell titled We Posed for Grant Wood, where he did a great deal of research on as many of Grant Wood's models as he possibly could. And so, of course, for a presentation like this was very useful to learn a little bit more about who these people were and what they did. And I thought I would mention it here as well, just in case you might also be interested in checking it out to learn more about some of the other people that appear in Grant Wood works. Portraiture is an interesting area of Grant Wood's career. It seemed that it may not have been his favorite aspect of his work, but he was often pressed into painting portraits, sometimes because he needed the money that would come from those commissions, and other times because it was hard to say no to the people that were asking. So it's an interesting grouping to look at. And we'll get started here. I'm working somewhat chronologically, although we'll go back and forth a little bit. But I wanted to start with this relief plaque of Marvin Cohn from 1920. So for 3 months in the summer of 1920, Grant Wood and his best friend, Marvin Cohn, traveled to Paris to see artworks, to soak up the sights, and to paint as well. This trip was really pivotal for both of these artists. It enhanced their interest in Impressionism and in painting on plein air or outside in these sites. Here you're seeing an example from Grant Wood, Misty Day, which Sean Ulmer, our director, just did a presentation on this work. If you're interested in learning more, that's on our YouTube page. And each of these artists, although they didn't continue painting in the style that you see here beyond the early 1930s, the trip to Paris, which was Wood's first trip abroad and Cohn's second, was critical to their development as artists. And what they did, what they saw, and what they painted was also outlined in Cohn's quite meticulous and pretty well-written diary of the trip, including where they were painting on each of these days. And it was a somewhat rainy summer, so they were not only outdoors painting, on some occasions they were also indoors. And so on July 22nd, in Marvin Cohn's diary, he wrote, quote, modeled in room all morning, Grant making bas-relief of me, and I a doorbell arrangement. After dinner, hunted up foundry. Late in afternoon to Luxembourg Gardens to paint, wrote in evening, end quote. So here, what you're seeing is this sketch that Grant Wood created of Marvin Cohn, the one that he references where he's posing on July 22nd in the room, modeling all morning. And this provided the basis for the relief plaque, of Cohn's profile. We see it's a simple design, something that would be able to be reproduced in the plaque format, but still recognizably cone. Here you're seeing some of those details, the way that they're able to indicate the contours of his face, the subtle details in the hair there as well. And metalwork, of course, was something that Grant Wood was interested in, that he had worked in prior to this. And so there's this continued interest in this form. On the back of the piece, this is a blurry photo, excuse that, but there is a little mark there on the back of the piece indicating the foundry where this was created, possibly the foundry that Cohn mentions in that diary entry. This is the Claude Valswani foundry. The Valswani family came from Italy to France, and then Claude established his foundry in 1905 in Paris at 74 Rue de Plante. This was a firm that worked for a number of famous artists, including Renoir, Picasso, and Matisse. So it was kind of where you would go if you wanted something created, if you wanted something cast, you would go to this foundry. So Grant Wood would have taken in that drawing, a plaster would have been created, and then on to the bronze final work. We don't have a number on this piece, so we don't know exactly how many were created in this edition. However, typically at this foundry, they would often work in editions of 10 or less. So it may have been around that number that were created, although we can't be sure, not having a numbered piece. And Marvin Cohn, of course, was an accomplished artist himself. He never achieved the fame of Grant Wood, but he was highly respected by his contemporaries, and his work displays the rare sensitivity that he used to reflect his environment. But he also had an incredible impact on the many students that he taught at Coe College for 4 decades. So somebody that Grant Wood had easy access to and was able to depict in one of these kind of earlier portrait works that we're looking at today. Going along with this, I also wanted to take a look at another of these metal plaques, another relief portrait, this time of Charles B. Keeler. This probably came from before the Paris trip, so it may have been a little earlier, kind of more in the 1910s. And here he's depicting Charles B. Keeler. Keeler was an artist. He was born in 1882. And by 1920, by the time that Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn go on this Paris trip, he was an internationally known artist, specializing in etchings, but he also did landscape painting and photography as well. He was from a Cedar Rapids family, and his father was an attorney for the Milwaukee Railroad in Chicago. Keeler would attend Harvard University and graduated in 1905. He initially trained as an architect, but then entered the Art Institute of Chicago and traveled the world from 1908 to 1912. He was in Gibraltar when World War I started, but he returned to Iowa and joined the Army, and actually was stationed at Camp Dodge in Des Moines, which is also where Grant Wood was. However, unlike Grant Wood, Charles Keeler did go overseas for a period of time. In 1920, he was also married, and he moved to California in 1921. But he returned to Cedar Rapids often and participated in the Stone City Art Colony in 1932 and 33, and maintained friendships with many Cedar Rapids artists. While at the colony, it's even reported that Grant Wood shared his ice wagon housing with Keeler. And also, it's possible that those two families were related, the Keelers and the Woods, through Grant's mother's side. Another kind of interesting thing about this plaque is that it was a piece that was still in Grant Wood's possession. One of them was still in Grant Wood's possession at the time of his death, and then remained with his sister Nan for much of her life as well. And she displayed it on the wall of the bathroom in her California home. So in this case, this plaque is a little bit larger than the plaque of Cohn that we were looking at. And there's no maker's mark on the back, so we don't know exactly where or when it was cast, but it's from around this similar time period, but probably a little bit earlier. Also, in this sort of early 1920s time period, we can look at this sketch of James Bever Norris from 1920. So in September of 1920, Norris and his mother were traveling on the ship the Grampian back from Europe, as were Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn and other Cedar Rapidians as well. Norris's mother was familiar with both of the artists, and she was actually a patron of Grant Wood's. They were an influential Cedar Rapids family. James's great-grandfather started the Bever Land Company, which would eventually give Cedar Rapids the land for the boulevard and the park that bear their name. The family had moved to Washington State when James was 10 years old, but they came back regularly to stay on top of business interests in the Cedar Rapids area. So on the trip, James was actually sharing a stateroom with Wood while his mother took the room next to them. And here is a photograph that James took of Wood on this trip. James was 17 at the time, and Wood made 5 sketches of the young man, but only this one is known to have survived, and no one really knows what happened to the other 4. This one, however, stayed with the family and was eventually donated to the art museum. In this drawing, Wood depicts James in profile, highlighting the contours of his face, his jawline, the wisps of hair at the top of his head, and the back of his coat with white. It's kind of a subdued portrait. We're only seeing half of his face in profile. He's looking down, and he appears perhaps a little bit older here than his 17 years. So it's kind of a quieter portrait, but still very sensitive in the way that he's rendering the figure. In his later years, James would go on to attend Columbia University in New York and studied architecture. And he was also quite musical and had a wonderful singing voice. So he performed as a concert singer both in the United States and abroad before he continued on with his work as an architect. Here you're seeing a program from one of his concerts. And while he was still in his 20s, he designed and built a new family home in Seattle that he called Bevner, partly inspired by places that he had seen and loved in Europe on his travels. Norris would settle in Beverly Hills, California with his wife, and together they would have 5 children. Now we'll move a little later in the decade to 1929. And this portrait, Master Gordon Fennell, or young Gordon, aged 3. So here we are, 9 years later from the James Bever Norris piece, and there's a lot of change that's gone on for Wood within that time period. In the 20s, he's transitioning from being a teacher to becoming a full-time artist. He had resigned from his teaching positions that he held from 1919 to 1925 with the encouragement of his patron and landlord, David Turner. And since that first 1920 trip, he had been to Europe another 3 times by this point, his last trip being in 1928 to supervise making the stained glass commission for the Veterans Memorial window in Munich. On that trip to Munich, he was looking at the work that was surrounding him in that area. So he saw paintings by Hans Memling, other artists, looking at sort of Northern Renaissance, Northern Gothic portraits that were in the different museums that he was going to in Munich at that time. He also saw Neue Sachlichkeit work, or New Objectivity, a style of German art that was popular in the 1920s, characterized by harder edge painting, sort of a return to realism. And these artists were really concentrating on realistic representations of their modern surroundings, and also looking toward the 15th century Northern Gothic painters that were enjoying a surge of popularity in that time. So Grant Wood was really admiring the same sorts of painters as his German contemporaries of that time period. This exposure would be very influential on his subsequent output, but he didn't move to that style instantaneously. He was slowly mulling over what he had seen. It also wasn't a direct jump from seeing things to immediately changing what he was doing. These were also ideas that were already existing for Grant Wood prior to that 1928 trip. So there are things that were already kind of coming into his work that he was thinking about and mulling over and working on as he moves into the 1930s and his mature work. So portraiture in particular would be where that mature style really starts to appear. But he had worked in various styles throughout the 1920s, and that harder edge style can be seen in his portraiture work, which by the very nature of the subject matter tends to be tighter and more true to life than other genres of painting. So it lends itself well to the direction that he was sort of already thinking about and already moving into. During this time, he's also taking on commissions, in particular portrait commissions, as a revenue stream that would allow him to make a living, support his mother and sister, and go on to create work eventually that was not made for commission. And there were quite a few members of the Cedar Rapids community that were interested in fostering the arts and actively supported Grant Wood. And they really helped him establish himself as a professional artist. So in this case, this is a piece that was commissioned by John C. Reed and presented to Mr. and Mrs. Gordon Fennell, representing their son. The senior Gordon Fennell was president of the Gordon Fennell Company, and his grandfather, John C. Reed, the grandfather of young Gordon here in the portrait, John C. Reed, was the president of the 3-Minute Cereal Company at the time. So here we're seeing this lovely portrayal of the 3-year-old Gordon, who sits upright on the edge of a huge overstuffed chair with bright lights on either side, illuminating this sort of expressive facial expression that he has on, and also the smooth, baby round surfaces of his hands, which toy with a ball. He has a look of childlike joy and excitement. He appears like a little boy, as if someone has just grabbed his attention. He seems to sort of be looking up and engaging with them in that way. His cheeks are a bit rosy. He appears kind of in the prime of health. And despite the fancy clothes that he's wearing and the sort of elaborate armchair that he's sitting in, he still appears very much like a child. Um, and here is that oversized armchair, kind of like a little throne that he sits in. He's buttressed on the side with pillows. And those pillows, too, give us some indication of Grant Wood's interest in the decorative and of rendering these decorative objects and decorative patterns within his work. He holds a ball in his hands. And that, too, is something that occurs quite frequently in the Northern Renaissance portraiture that he was looking at. Oftentimes, those featured in the portraits would hold some sort of an attribute that was meant to give you an idea of who they were, indicate something to the viewer about who was being depicted. And that's something that Grant Wood does frequently. And in this case, the boy holds the little ball in his hands. It seems like Grant Wood may have been sort of playing with the top of the chair here. There's some interesting things going on with the lines of the chair where perhaps he was changing things, kind of moving things around. Maybe it was something where it was originally intended to be a little smaller or a little lower down for the top of the work. So there's something kind of interesting going on up there, some changes that perhaps were occurring as Grant Wood was working on the piece. Now, as we're looking at this work and thinking about it as this kind of lovely representation of a very childlike looking child, this wasn't the first time that he had done a representation like this for a portrait of a child. So 2 years prior, in 1927, he created this portrait of Sally Staymates, one of his earliest and also most sensitive portraits. It was painted inside their family home. And again, here too, she's also holding her little attribute in her hand, a block with an S to represent her name. So he's already thinking about some of these things in 27, already bringing them into his portraiture work. Also, again, that emphasis on the decorative, the wallpaper pattern here, and the colors are reflected in the embroidery on her collar, showing that attention to detail and really highlighting those decorative elements in the work. Here too, with Sally Staymates, there's a life and vitality to the portrait. She has kind of a shine and a sparkle in her eyes, a rosy glow to her cheeks, as if she's just been playing hard and just sat down for just a minute here. And even her position with a leg through the arm of the chair, rather than sitting straight on, feels very true to life, like a child who's allowed to be depicted as a child, rather than a more idealized representation. And so portraits like this resulted in additional requests from people. They were quite successful, so they resulted in more requests from others to do portraits. And he would go on to do more of them as his career continued. And so we see a lot of those same things that were happening with Sally Staymates in 1927, here too in this work featuring Gordon Fennell in 1929. Young Gordon would go on to graduate from Franklin High School in Cedar Rapids, and then attended Stanford University and graduated in 1949. He was quite successful in college. He had a high GPA, he was Phi Beta Kappa, and he was nominated for a Rhodes Scholarship. Unfortunately, he died suddenly in 1954 at the age of 28 after being only ill for a couple of days. But it was said that he had a cerebral condition, so that could have contributed to that short illness and sort of sudden death that occurred. At that time, he had returned to Cedar Rapids, and he was involved in a taxi cab business and was also a member of the community theater. In this same year, in 1929, Grant Wood also creates Portrait of Judge M.D. Porter from 1929. Judge Marcellus Denton Porter began his career as a judge in Anamosa, Iowa, and later moved to Cedar Rapids. He was a lawyer. He served as a Superior Court judge in Oelwein from 1906 to 1910, when the family then moved to Cedar Rapids. And it seemed that his colleagues held a lot of respect for him and quite liked him. So one wrote, quote, "I tried cases before him after he was elevated to the bench of the Superior Court at Oelwein. And as a judge, he was impartial, a good listener and student, and his conclusions generally sound. Since his coming to Cedar Rapids 4 years ago, I have observed him to be a careful, painstaking lawyer and a good investigator of legal questions." End quote. This portrait was commissioned by Pearl Porter in 1920, after he had passed away in 1928 at 49 years old. So his widow, Pearl, had reached out at that time in the year afterward and asked Grant to create this portrait. Mrs. Porter was familiar with Wood's landscapes, and she had seen some of his portraits of individuals, and so she wanted a painting that would really honor her late husband's memory. So Grant Wood was working from a black and white photograph of Porter in order to produce the final painted portrait. And there's a great deal of similarity between that photograph to that finished portrait. I do think, though, there is a difference between the portraits where Wood had access to the sitter and was working in life, at least for part of the process, and then those that were posthumous. Of course, there's a difference there in how they end up looking. There's a little bit more of a stoic feeling to this portrait. It feels a little more static, perhaps a little stilted, less of a lively quality than what we saw just with the previous portrait of Gordon Fennell. And it kind of gives you the sense that this is a posthumous portrait. It feels like that. There is a little more separation between the viewer and the sitter in this portrait. Grant Wood, when he was creating this piece, also carved and gilded the frame that accompanies it as well. He would do only 2 portraits after the subject had died, and so the other portrait that he created was the portrait of Frances Fiske Marshall from the same year. So these were done in the same year. She was the wife of the Cedar Rapids Gazette editor Vern Marshall, and she died of a sudden illness at 33 years old, leaving behind 4 young daughters. Her husband approached their friend, Grant Wood, and asked him to paint her portrait from memory and from a few photographs, memorializing her so that her daughters could remember her. Frances and her husband were among the early friends and sponsors of Grant Wood, so they were familiar with him. He was familiar with them. They had spent time together socially. And so he had a little bit more to go on here. I'm not sure how familiar he was with Judge Porter before creating that portrait. If he had any examples from life or any memories from life that he was working on, or if he only had the photograph. There does seem to be a little bit more familiarity here with the Frances Fiske Marshall portrait compared to what we see with the Judge Porter image as well. And when we think about these 2 portraits and compare them to the portraits of children that were done from life that we just saw, there is perhaps that greater feeling of separation between the viewer and the subject of the portrait. Moving right along to our next portrait. This is John B. Turner, Pioneer, from 1928 to 1930. So here now, we're going back a little bit, back to 1928. It's kind of an interesting thing here going on with the dating, which I'll talk about. So in 1928, before the Munich trip, he paints a portrait of John B. Turner, who was the father of David Turner, Grant Wood's great friend and patron, and John B. Turner was also one of his patrons as well. And here, even in 1928, there was already some of that hardness and detail that would dominate his subsequent work in his regionalist mature style. So what happened here with that date, he creates it in 1928, and then in 1930, he goes back and he reworks it after developing his style further at that time. So he might have been dissatisfied with the portrait because it didn't have enough of the qualities that he was moving into and wanted to go back and kind of fix things. But that's why, if you look at the piece, you'll see there on the left, the photograph on the left, there's a signature from 1928 there. So originally it was in a square format. And then in 1930, he puts the work into an oval frame and then signs it again there on the right with Grant Wood 1930. So that explains sort of that gap in time that we're looking at and what was going on there. When he was reworking the piece, he probably strengthened the lines of the composition and, like I said, put the portrait in a gold frame with an oval rather than a square format. And that oval format emphasized the roundness of the head of the sitter, as well as gave the portrait a little bit more of a Victorian look that Wood was really wanting to come through in the work. When that frame was removed, that's when that 1928 date came to light. And you can still see, I'll go back to the detail, you can still see the line of where that oval frame would have been. So that's what's going on there. If you notice that line on the surface of the work, that's from that switch in frames. So this is really the first figural work in which Wood is trying to capture the idea of the Midwesterner. It is both a portrait of a specific person, but also meant to encompass something larger, a bigger idea, more of an archetype that's being communicated here. And the Midwesterner was this sort of distinct character type that Grant Wood felt had developed out of the struggle to conquer the frontier. This was also one of his first successes in his new style of painting. Very highly delineated, meticulously detailed scenes of everyday people and life centered around his Iowa home. And the public agreed as well. They liked this too. It actually won first prize for portraiture at the Iowa State Fair in 1929. So here, the sitter is juxtaposed. He is, this portrait of a prominent businessman, the father of his patron, David Turner. He's juxtaposed with his background, which is an 1869 Lynn County map. This was an actual map that belonged to the sitter, one of his prized possessions. And this was a really intentional background that Wood put with the image of John B. Turner as a reference to the interrelationship of place and identity, symbolizing this idea of the frontier that the figure was instrumental in developing. So he's really linking the two together and creating this sort of legacy, this history being depicted just in the portrait format. John B. Turner was an undertaker, and he was part of a growing group of men who were establishing funeral parlors outside of the home, but in a home-like setting. And Grant Wood had helped John's son David to remodel the mansion home that would become their mortuary at the corner of 2nd Avenue and 8th Street here in Cedar Rapids, which is now the History Center. John B. Turner, like I mentioned, was also one of Wood's first patrons. He would help finance his trips to Europe, and he also, along with David, provided him the use of the studio space and also commission work as well. And it seems that the sitter liked this portrait. He referred to it as, quote, two old maps. So it seems that he liked this piece. As we take a closer look here, we see he's not romanticizing the figure, he's not idealizing the figure, but rather portraying a sense of life and age. We see the lined surface of the sitter's face, and also eyes that seem to indicate that they've experienced life, that they've seen things throughout their life. Again, that background with the map has lines that crisscross over the surface, and these almost seem to connect to the sitter's glasses, going through the glasses and continuing out to the other side, really making explicit that connection between the sitter and the land, between this area in which he settled and developed. This is where he had lived out his years from the time that he settled here in the 1880s. Cedar Rapids, where he had spent most of his adult life, appears just to the left of his head, so we see it here in this detail. And this was actually a little bit of artistic license that Grant Wood took in depicting the map. He actually removes a column of area on the map in order to fit both Cedar Rapids there to the left of his head and the little vignettes, the little scenes of early homesteads and public buildings to the right of John B. Turner. So he adjusts things within the map to make it work for how he wanted this portrait to be created and the things that he wanted to include in that portrait. So those scenes are things that John B. Turner would have encountered upon his arrival, forming that border on the right. And when this piece was finished, David Turner said, quote, "To me, that isn't a portrait of my father, that is my father," end quote. So he too seems to have really appreciated the details that were included and the way that Grant Wood represented John B. Turner here. Wood is really considering him as a businessman pioneer, thinking about him as sort of a civilizing force on this area. And there is some of that pioneer character that he's incorporating in the face, something kind of serious, but at the same time, a little bit upturned corner of the mouth there, giving him a little bit more personality here too as well. He's contrasting that modern day businessman with those frontier beginnings and thinking about the idea of the progress of the Midwest, even within one person's lifetime. And that was something that he wanted to highlight and felt should be celebrated. The retired businessman here is portrayed as sort of a respectable elder of the community and then made monumental by the way that he's being portrayed. Again, he's sort of elevated beyond just a straight commissioned portrait to an idea of something more monumental, more archetypal of this idea of the Midwesterner and the pioneer businessman kind of developing this area. And this is something that he explores further in other works as well. So one example of that is Woman with Plants. This is one of the first works where he really starts to move into a style influenced by the lessons that he learned from Flemish artists that he had been building on throughout this time period. And in this work, the visible brushstrokes and the dappled sunlight of his Impressionist works are replaced with a smooth surface and a new solidness to his trees, hills, and figures. Again, thinking about that sort of Northern Renaissance portrait style, she too holds her attribute in her hands. In the case of John B. Turner, I think we could think about the backdrop there of the map being his attribute, whereas here she holds the Sansevieria plant as an image meant to make us think of hardiness and kind of indicate that that's who she is as this Midwestern woman. There's an autumnal background here. Again, he's thinking about age, thinking about the richness and fullness of a life nearing its close, embodying that strength and determination of the pioneer woman. And again, making her, this portrait was based on his mother, Hattie, but making her into sort of a monumental icon to women of the Midwest, sort of an archetypal portrait of Midwesternness and a symbol for all pioneer women here. He's telling her story through the use of those details, her weathered hands, her wedding ring, and that hardy plant that she holds. Oh, and there's again, just a reminder of what we're looking at here with that portraiture that he was being inspired by. And this would lead into the creation of American Gothic in the next year, really kind of confirming his direction, his new style, something that he was developing, this unique style for him in the regional area. And it's another in his sort of series of icons of the Midwest. This piece, of course, would be very successful and would lead to his work being in high demand in the coming years. In the same year as American Gothic, in 1930, we can look next at Arnold Comes of Age, Portrait of Arnold Pyle from 1930. So Arnold Pyle, here, the subject of this work, was born in 1908 in Cedar Rapids and lived there throughout the rest of his life. He was actually a student of Grant Wood's when Wood was an 8th grade art teacher at McKinley Junior High School. And when Pyle graduated in 1927, he became an assistant to Grant Wood. This piece was painted in celebration of Pyle's 21st birthday, and it was one of the first in that new style that he's working into in this time period. Really painted during that year where he's transitioning from Impressionism to regionalism, but he is still wavering between hard-edged realism and earlier, softer styles of Impressionism, but still thinking about that Northern Renaissance portraiture and incorporating that here too as well. Pyle actually became a self-taught painter himself after years of mentoring from Wood, Cohn, and another local artist, Adrian Dornbush. He was part of the Stone City Art Colony and taught painting and framing classes there. And he also exhibited at the Iowa State Fair Art Competition and won the Sweepstakes Prize in 1936 for his painting Big Hook, which concerned a train wreck in Solon, Iowa. In 1935, Pyle took a position with the Collins Radio Company and worked there until 1968. And in his retirement, he returned to painting, but more so in an abstract style rather than his previous realistic style. He was killed in an automobile accident in 1973 while he was returning home from the initial Grant Wood Art Festival near Anamosa. So in this painting, we're seeing Pyle represented in this sort of elongated half view of his image against a very stylized landscape. On the sleeve of his shirt, we see a small butterfly, which we can think of as symbolizing this metamorphosis in life, the changes that one goes through in life. But also we can think about it as sort of a fleeting creature of beauty, something that, like adolescence, is sort of a short-lived thing. Looking at a couple of details here in the background. So there's a river in the background, which has been considered sort of a river of life. And it's separating that near bank from that far bank that we have in this image. So on the near bank, we have two nude teens kind of frolicking, about to go swimming, getting into the water there, as well as a sapling on the near bank, representing youth, representing kind of a carefree earlier days. And then on the far bank, we have the mature trees and also the shocks of wheat that are ripened. So thinking about that transition into maturity with what's being represented on either side of the bank there. The river also echoes the horizontal expanse of the sky in the area above. And it also kind of harkens to remembrances of childhood, of more carefree past, of experiences as a child going swimming in local lakes and rivers and ponds and things like that. So also drawing on those associations with this work as well. There are gradations of light and dark that are giving structure to the face of Arnold Pyle here. And there's interesting things going on with the background and with the kind of contrast between flat and three-dimensional forms going on here. So it feels quite shallow. It's quite a shallow space that's created. There is an atmospheric one-point perspective at work here, but there's something interesting going on between the illusion of volume and that recessed space with the very flat areas of the work, like what we see with the sweater and the butterfly, where it almost seems to be right up against the picture plane, if not on top of the picture plane there. It can feel somewhat artificial looking. The background can feel like a backdrop, almost as if it's a stage play, sort of artificially lit from the front with this backdrop in the back. So there is this discrepancy among the solid flat and more three-dimensional forms within the work. And this may have resulted from conflicting desires from the artist to both render things in an illusionistic fashion to make it look quite realistic, but at the same time, perhaps wanting to kind of emulate a more primitive style of painting, something more akin to early American folk art paintings, and whether those two things are kind of at odds here as he's working on the piece. Even the scale here is kind of interesting. The scale for Arnold from the rest of the composition feels a bit skewed. The nude figures, although they seem to be fairly nearby, are tiny in comparison to the sitter, who's very close up to that front of the picture plane, very close to us as the viewer. And throughout, there's also a melancholy sort of sadness about the piece. Even looking at the expression of Arnold as he's kind of looking out, he appears kind of melancholy, kind of sad. And possibly Wood was thinking about the ambivalence of growing up and the struggle to find identity in the adult world. So these are all things that could have been at play here. Some say that this is also a portrayal full of affection for the sitter, for Arnold Pyle, but others have also argued that the identity of the sitter is much less important than in the overall theme that Grant Wood was wanting to establish in the piece. So the age, the physical type of the sitter, as well as the apparel, the accessories, and the background, all of that was more important in creating the overall theme than actually who the sitter themselves were. So a lot of different kind of interpretations, a lot of different things being thought of with this piece. So it's quite an interesting one to look into further. In the next year, he creates Plaid Sweater in 1931. Here again, sort of painted in his new style, not reverting back to any previous more academic portraiture styles. And here he's representing Melvin or Mel Bloomberg. The Bloombergs were a prosperous family in Clinton, Iowa. They owned a merchandise store called Clinton Tobacco Candy and Supply Company. And his family had seen a newspaper article about Grant Wood winning a prize in Chicago for a work titled American Gothic. And so they were interested in reaching out about a portrait of their son. And at this time, Grant Wood was feeling a little ambivalent about portraiture. Um, so he set a price much higher than what he was usually charging, kind of hoping that they wouldn't go for it. But they did. They still wanted to move forward. So he did create the portrait. And I've heard a couple of things about how we ended up with the clothing that Mel is wearing here. In one case, I've heard that Wood was only willing to do it if he could choose the clothes. I've also heard that he wanted Melvin to be able to choose the clothes. So it may have been a combination of those things. But either way, he ends up in his kind of football costume that he's wearing there, favorite clothes perhaps for the sitter. One of the quotes that is attributed to Grant Wood from creating this portrait, he's said to have said, quote, "I want him to look like a real boy, not like Lord Fauntleroy, or he'll hate me when he grows up," end quote. So that was quite important to him. Again, that idea that a boy, a child, should look like a child and not sort of like a grown up in miniature. Um, and the family, it seems, were really happy with the finished painting. It ended up being a Christmas gift from the wife, from Esther Bloomberg, to her husband. And Mel Bloomberg has also been quoted about his remembrances of posing for Grant Wood. So he said, quote, "What impressed me was that I never actually posed. When we met, Wood made notes of my skin tones, coloring, facial structure, and I suppose he made some sketches, but I can't say. A few weeks later, my parents took me to his studio at Turner Alley in Cedar Rapids. Again, I didn't pose, he just made notes," end quote. So here we see the slightly surly, perhaps, nature of a boy who would rather be outside playing football. And that was something that Grant Wood seemed to have really enjoyed kind of playing into, that football fantasy, which also allowed him to indulge in his own interest in the decorative by creating that plaid sweater and rendering every square of that brightly patterned argyle. This contrast, there's sort of a lot of order and geometry present in that plaid sweater that contrasts with the more naturalistic rounded forms of the trees behind him. Very kind of ornamental trees, something that he was very much doing, moving into at this time period. There is a direct light from close above and slightly to the side, as if from a flood lamp, that's illuminating the face and extending the effect with highlights in the sitter's eyes as well. No one is quite sure where that title came from, if it was the family or if it was Grant Wood, but Mel Bloomberg graduated from high school in 1941 and the University of Iowa in 1947 with a degree in business. He was a World War II veteran. He was a self-taught painter, and he also owned and operated the Clinton Tobacco Candy and Supply Company. until he eventually retired in 1981. He passed away in 2003 at the age of 79, and he and his wife had one son, three daughters, and 12 grandchildren. So the last work that I wanted to cover is The American Golfer from 1940. So going a little bit later here. This is a portrait of Charles Campbell from Kalamazoo, Michigan, who was a banker and a community booster and a businessman. And it was commissioned by his son-in-law, Merrill Taylor, who asked Grant Wood to do the portrait. Grant Wood actually came out and spent about a week at the Campbells, and he's quoted as saying that they were extremely worthwhile citizens. Here, Campbell is portrayed at the end of a golf swing, watching the arc of his ball with this expression of hopefulness. He has kind of a searching gaze upward, and the club head of his golf club there and the oak branch also draw attention to the colonial residence in the background. And this type of portrait is a little bit different for Grant Wood. It's said that he thought that action pictures were kind of tiresome to look at, but he thought there was a place at the end of a golf swing before the club dropped when the subject was completely relaxed, and that was the pose that he chose for Campbell. The background here, too, depicts an idyllic rural landscape in the Midwest in that characteristic regionalist style. It's picturesque countryside with lush rolling green fields, manicured trees, and the imposing colonial residence in the background, all meant to kind of emphasize the American values of this man and of his family. The grounds are pruned to perfection, and again, that association is supposed to be that the Campbells were descended from this merchant class of gentry of New England, who in their own portraits would have also been posed before sprawling estates in colonial portraiture. So thinking very much of history and legacy and incorporating that into the piece as well. The zigzag line of the road, which was continued by the raised arm and the golf club, also add a dynamic element to the composition. And here again, he's kind of pursuing a subject that he had been exploring throughout his career, that of aging. Campbell here, as Grant Wood represents him, is an older gentleman confidently enjoying the fruits of his life and his passion for golf. The fall season is evoked by the colors of the leaves, again alluding to the golfer's age, and the fallen acorn hints at the continuing cycle of life. And Grant Wood spent a great deal of time perfecting the composition. He wrote in 1940 in a letter to the Taylors, quote, "I have brought down the sky on the painting, reintroduced the oak leaves, and made some other changes that make the picture a more harmonious unit. It will be a much better painting to live with over a period of years than it was before. When I finally ship it to you, you will know that it is the best work of which I am capable." End quote. You'll also notice with that title, The American Golfer, kind of an unusual title there. And it's possible that he had it in mind as more of a major picture, one that would be distributed a little bit farther and called The American Golfer. But the Taylors and the Campbells considered it a family matter and asked that prints were not made. So I wanted to put it here along with John B. Turner to kind of emphasize and think about that idea that even with Charles Campbell here, he is also being made into something kind of grander than just a straight portrait, that he too is being made into this sort of icon, this archetype of something of America, right? Something that's being communicated here with our American golfer. So I wanted to include those two together here as well. This is one of Wood's last large-scale works before his untimely death in 1942. And so that the subjects here at play, seasonal change, aging, the life cycle, all of that takes on greater significance when we kind of keep that in mind and know that this is a portrait toward the end of his life. So I'll kind of wrap things up here before I see if any of you have questions. But although each of these are very different portraits, different people, different lives led, I think as we look at them in a group, there are some things that kind of carry through into all of them, some through lines. And for me, one of the biggest is this interest in aging and reflecting on a life that I see Grant Wood doing in these works, and figuring out how to represent a life at different time periods as well, whether that's in youth, like with Gordon Fennell and Mel Bloomberg, stepping into adulthood with Arnold Pyle, and the reflection on a life in one's later years with John B. Turner and Charles Campbell in American Golfer. They form a really interesting grouping to take a look at. And so I hope this has been interesting for you as well and illuminating. And I'm happy to do my best to answer any questions that you have at this time. Let me stop sharing and allow you to unmute if you'd like. Hang on one sec. Okay, you should be able to unmute if you have questions. I'm happy to try to answer. Or feel free to write in the chat. Either way. And oh, question from Renell. When did Charles Campbell die? That is a good question, and I don't know that I had that in my notes. I don't think I did. I would have to go back and take a look at that. I don't know off the top of my head, but that's a good question. Thanks, Renell. I'll have to look into that.
And Julia, can you hear me?
Yes,
I'm
I can.
popping in here. Yeah.
I can,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, hi. Just kind of wondering, I asked about Charles Campbell's death. I assume he lived to see this, right? See this painting. Do you have any comments on what he thought of the portrait?
Well, it took Grant Wood a long time to finish it. And so I am kind of curious about that length of time, because I think it was a few years that he was working on this before finally finishing in 1940. So I don't know kind of what that discussion was like, if there was discussion between Grant Wood and the Campbells and Taylors about how it was coming along and what it was looking like, and if there were concerns that led to that length of time being used. But I don't know. I didn't see anything specific about the reception of the work. But that would also be interesting to look into.
Yeah. When it was shown at the Whitney, there were some jokes that it looked like a particular vice president.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah, as I was looking at it, yeah, I had the same
Yeah.
thought. Yes.
Anyway, there's another question in the chat, so I'll mute myself.
Oh, perfect. Okay. How much did he charge for portrait commissions and how did it change over time? That's a great question. I know only for one of these, or at least I know the hearsay about one of these, which was Plaid Sweater. I mentioned that at that time, Grant Wood was not really wanting to do a lot of portraits. He didn't really want to kind of dive into that. So prior to that, he had been charging 300. At least that's what has been said. So for the Bloombergs, he said he would do it, but for twice as much, so 600, which I don't know if he expected them to agree to, but they did, and so that's what happened and how he ended up doing that Mel Bloomberg portrait. So at least at that time in 31, he had been doing 300, and at least for that portrait was able to get 600. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I so appreciate it. And I hope that you'll join us again for another Grant Wood in Focus or any of our other Zoom programs or in-person programs if you're able to attend. So come out, see what we have on view. And thank you so much for joining me. And I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday. Bye-bye.